good, my analysts, and welcome back to the practical applications of the Open Threat Hunting Framework video series. And today I want to talk to you about data. It's not an understatement to say that data is everything when it comes to threat hunting. It is going to be one of those aspects that is going to make or break your threat hunting program in terms of efficacy and efficiency. It's so important, in fact, that we actually put a whole section on data in the preparation phase of the framework to say, before you even start threat hunting, you need to know about data, what aspects of data is important in terms of threat hunting, and what are some exercises you can do to set yourself up for success. In today's video, what we're going to do is kind of walk through this process very quickly to think about how should I approach understanding my data before I start threat hunting, and how we can, modify and change the data, and then measure how good our data is. I'm going to show you some strategies on that. And we're going to go through a quick exercise to show about how can you improve your efficiency in terms of threat hunting by understanding what your data is and how it is presented to your analysts. Okay, so I know y'all been waiting for slides, and I promise you that in every video that I do, there's going to be slides. And additionally, there's also going to be a dog. So let's jump right in. Meet me over here. Okay, so we're going to talk about data today, and the first thing I'm going to talk about in the framework, one of the things that we talk about is the first thing you should do is do an audit of your data sources and understand what that is. In this, we have a really quick example here, and it can be in a spreadsheet. It's better if it's in some sort of manageable database where you can update fields quickly and easily. But if it's a spreadsheet, spreadsheets make the world go round. And what you want to do is just identify all your possible data sources you can have. Now, you probably start with your security tooling, which is fine. It's a good way to go. But as you get more and more advanced, as you mature as a threat hunting program, or if your mission changed to say hey, we're good to go on enterprise and I want our threat hunting program focused on OT, ICS, then your data sources are likely not going to be the same as they would for enterprise, right? Because in the OT ICS land, there's going to be a lot more raw log data that you're going to be working with rather than security telemetry, except for on the network side. But that's neither here nor there. And what I have is showed just an example here of okay, so what is this? What is the security tool? What's it function within the environment? What is the name of the product, just so you can differentiate in case you have more than one? Is a hunt established with the tech, and is it centralized? Now, you can break this out continually as you go, but this is basically just saying, here is our index of data sources. And we want to keep this up to date to understand as we get new data sources, or if they're discovered as you learn more about your environment, that they get updated and we're tracking whether or not we have a hunt established with them. Why that is important is because, if something exists as a data source that never seems to get a threat hunt established to it, you got to start asking your questions of why. Why aren't you threat hunting in that data? Is the data not valuable? Is it not applicable to the mission of the organization? And if it's centralized, maybe we need to reconsider whether or not we want to centralize that, unless it's feeding some sort of IT or other operational need. But by keeping this up to date, you can make a decision based on what you want to execute hunts on or even centralize, because everything has a dollar amount at the end, right? And we want to talk about value of data through this as well. And I think I've mentioned this a few different times before, but when you're talking about threat hunting, we want to think really carefully and hard about what we consider valuable data in terms of our threat hunting. In addition to keeping a data source, we want to build out, and in the framework, we talk about this more, and we talk about the importance of having a data dictionary and what that means. And you don't have to use the word dictionary, but what we want to say is now that we've identified our data sources, we also want to understand what that data looks like. So we want to do a modeling of all that data to understand the schema in which it presents itself. So field names, not only just the field names, but what is in those fields, what their associated attribute is, and keep that up to date. And as we add new data sources, because that is critical to have a good understanding as a whole of what your data looks like in a whole and how it's structured, because we can do that. And we're going to run through that exact exercise of why that is important and how you can leverage that understanding to make your hunts more efficient and effective. Okay, so when we're talking about data value, this is going to be kind of reminiscent of the first video in which we talked about understanding adversaries and mapping adversaries to data sources, et cetera. So in this example, and I understand that the text is very small, but you don't, for the purposes of what we're doing, you don't really need to read it. So this is a mind map of ITG19, and this is a different approach than using the one that I showed in episode 1, where we talked about mapping adversaries to data sources and data sources to techniques, et cetera, et cetera. This is just a different way to represent it because I want to show that there's multiple different options. So this is the mind map of how we understand ITG19, aka TA505, executes their attacks, right? So they're a financially motivated threat actor. For some reason, they're top of our list. We're just going to, in this land, we are going to say that. And this mind map shows, okay, so we're going to map ITG19 based on how we know they operate to a tactic, and based on that tactic to a technique, and from that technique get down to the tactical information to show how does TA505 actually manifest itself within that technique. And that's when we're talking about, we can use this information to really drive and answer the question, what is the most valuable data to our organization in terms of threat hunting? And we move right along, we can go there. So we can take that same approach and say, all those different techniques, all that tactical information, let me show, based on MITRE, which data sources are going to most likely going to contain evidence of TA505. Now, guys, that is a very important sentence I just said there, and it can be very, very valuable to your organization. When you're talking about considering what is valuable data, the metric that I like to use, you don't have to use it, but I've, a lot of organizations that I've worked with, when I've suggested this approach, have found a lot of value. When we're talking about either centralizing data, buying new tech, onboarding new solutions or anything like that, we've got to answer the question, what value does it bring? And from a threat hunting point of view, the metric that we want to chase is, we want to ever increase the value of the data that a human eye is looking at, right? So if we are continually increasing the value of the data that a human has to look at, then we're doing a good job. And we can measure value by saying, a data source is more valuable with the likelihood that it's going to contain adversary activity. And you can do this on a weighted value to say, okay, at the very top, the most valuable data is going to be the one that is most likely going to contain adversary or malware information. And then you can go to a next level and say, okay, well, the next rank on that, and the next weight on the scale, say the likelihood that a data source is going to contain a policy violation, and then, or an enabler of the attack. And you can use this and build this kind of rubric out to make an actual measurement of the value of data. And if you use this exercise on here, you could back this up with some real data that you can go to management and go to budget and say, hey, we need to invest in X because here is its value score based on the threats that we know about or the adversaries that you care about. And that's a really strong place to be when you're talking about investment. And so in this case, we can see, if we take ITG19, that mind map down and say, okay, so process monitoring is the most valuable data source, right? And then, you can see this in MITRE. If you can't infer upon it, process monitoring, and then the third place position there is process command line parameters. Those are, normally together. And that, when you fuse that, now you get, oh, wow, this becomes a super valuable. But you can take this at face value too and just say, hey, I'm going to do process monitoring and then file monitoring and then command line arguments. But for the purposes of this, we're going to put them together just so it's quick and easy, so we can just do one example. Okay, so now we're going to say, all right, so I'm going to push process monitoring and process command line parameters to the top of my list. Now, if I have a good data dictionary, I can go back to that and say, hey, where of all the data sources that I have, which solutions or which areas are going to contain that type of data? And now that's awesome, because we're going to use that to actually drive where we're going to execute our threat hunt in, right? So that's great. If we go back to our list here, we can see that we have EDR technology, we have some hunts established with it. It's centralized. And then we have Windows event logs that's centralized as well. In the Windows event logs, we know that we're going to have sysmon and 4688s. Now, it would be great, and EDR, most are going to have process data, but we go in there and check, yeah, it's got process data. Great. Now, it would be great if we just had one data source that across all systems, like everything's got the EDR. The EDR is compatible with everything under the sun, and it does all the things. Perfect solution. Now, what you're going to find out in reality that is not the case, right? You're definitely going to have part of your fleet that is rolling sysmon and that you can't get EDR installed on. That's just reality. You're going to find that EDR is covering the endpoints but not the servers. That's just reality. I've seen this stuff in real life. So now we have here, we're showing on here, here's our 3 different data sources, all focused on process creation events with command line parameters. We have the Windows event log 4688, we have sysmon running on some systems, and we have our EDR. Now, each one of these contextually is containing the same type of information, but their schemas are drastically different. And now because we understand the schema and the model, what we can do is start to build sort of a relational database to say, hey, you know what, EDR data, it relates to 4688s and it relates to sysmons on these different attribute paths. And that's great because those are the type of things that you can really key in on to improve the efficiency. So instead of saying I'm going to execute a hunt on 3 different data sources for some particular process execution event, I need to say, okay, I see this, but the context of the data remains the same. So I need to go about building out how do I execute this hunt across all 3 data sources at once, because that's going to allow me to be more efficient, right? Increase the number of hunts that I execute within a month. That's a great metric to keep because you can show how you improve. Doing things like this is going to make that number go up because instead of having to run 3 individual ones, I'm going to run 1, and we're going to show what that exercise looks like when I talk about data modeling and understanding what that actually looks like. Now, there's a lot of different names for this. The one that I have worked with the most is the common information model. There is a billion of different ones you could call it. The principles stay the same. That we're going to do it. I'm going to call it the common information model. You can call it whatever you want, and that's fine. So, and we're going to start with very basic attributes here. So within the process execution events, I've made some, I've done an audit, right? Gone through to my data source, my data dictionary, and saw the schemas and which ones relate to each other. Found, looking at the raw events and be like, okay, so we have some associated right here. And I put the different boxes in there to show how they're associated. And then from there, you can look back and see, okay, here's our common information model. And I'm going to say, well, the common information model attribute, we're going to call proc name, command line, and PID. And where does that map to the different fields within the 3 different data sources? And that's great. So now I can say, now I'm building towards that area where we're taking a level of abstraction to say, here is the raw event. My common information model runs on top of that, and it understands the differences with it and is able to interact with each one of those data sources. So what does that look like in practical application? So if we run our search here for our test event, now I have mentioned in videos 1 and actually showed through the threat hunting process about doing data creation and data validation. I'm telling you guys, when you're building out your data dictionary and you're building out the process to understand your data better, take that piece and put it in there too, because it works fantastic as a way to understand what your data looks like and how it's going to be represented to your analysts. So I went through and created a test event, right? Ran PowerShell with my keyword here. Then I can go through and say, okay, I have 4688s, I got sysmons, and I got my EDR execution. Great. They're all centralized, validated that they're in there, and I see my test event. And I go across that and I'm like, now I haven't done anything with that data yet. So I need to understand what that looks like from an attribute point of view. So we built our common information model. We have our our proc name, our command line, and PID. Now in this example, we're using Splunk, and we can do that very easily by creating some field aliases. And that's what this looks like. It's just saying, okay, for 4688, we're going to do new process ID equals PID. New process name equals proc name, and process command line equals command line. And we do that for each one of those data sources. And we do that, now we're start working towards a very easy way to search across all 3 different events using like fields so that we can actually build a hunt around it instead of having to do very complicated things. So this is churning and burning for a sec, and then we're going to get a table out to see whether or not we test it. And everything kind of looks good, right? So we're finding the same data in each one of the source types, and all of our proc names are matching up, and we could do some searches across that. We can understand what that's going to look like, and then we get to the PID here. And then this is why it's important when you're talking about the schema to not only understand what the field names are, but what the values are and what that actually looks like when it gets centralized. Now in EDR and in Sysmon, the PID is represented as a decimal value, but in 4688s in Windows, those come as hex. So now we got to go through the next exercise. So, okay, so we built our common information model. We're good with that. But now I need to know how to actually transform that data so that it fits nicely into our common information model. And you go through this various different ways. In Splunk, you could do this with transforms or macros or something along those lines, or any solution that you want to use out there. The method remains the same. The technology is completely irrelevant in this case because most SIMs or centralized logging sources, they can do the same exact thing. So this is just the example that I'm using. Use any kind of one you want. This is not an endorsement. So we're going to go back through and say, okay, so we need to work through 4688. We're going to remove our field alias because it's not going to work. And instead, what we're going to do is that we're going to do a transform. This is a one-time one. Obviously, you'd want to build this out as it's being ingested to show, we need to transform the hex value to a decimal so that we can search across all 3. Great. So now that we've done this, we're doing an evaluation, and we're saying using the to_number function to say on the new process ID field, actually evaluate that as a decimal, and then we're going to coalesce the PID and PID2, PID right from our field aliases. We're going to combine those into one new value called proc PID. So we're going to have to update our common information model, and we run this. What we're going to finally see is that we're going to be able to use common field values with a common schema across 3 different data sources, and now we can execute a hunt. And now we've really drastically improved the efficacy and efficiency of their hunt, because if you're running 3 different hunts at 3 different times, depending on that sliding window of how data is centralized, you may miss stuff, right? So you may end up introducing a gap or a blind spot unknowingly because you're doing it at 3 different areas. If we look at this again, now we look really nice. Everything's really tight, and now we can execute a hunt based on this data source, and we can repeat that for each one of the attributes in there. So it's a very easy kind of example, but that's really helpful. Now, finally, I want to talk about data quality. So now that we've understood, okay, how do you understand what a schema is, model it, create a common information model that's actually going to improve the efficiency of your hunt and the effectiveness of it, really. Now we need to do the care of, like, how do we long-term measure the quality of our data, not the value of our data. We're talking about the quality of the data, and the quality of the data is definitely going to be a huge impact on how good of a threat hunting program that you are. In the threat hunting framework, we introduced this aspect, and this has been known for a while. It's been used in data sciences for a long time, but it's applicable to threat hunting. And that's one of the great things that I really enjoyed about building the open threat hunting framework, is built as taking these things that have been established and work really well, that have been used in other areas of business and technology for a long time, and showing how we can apply them into threat hunting. In the one I'm going to talk about is the 6 dimensions of data quality and how we can use that to help threat hunting. So here are the 6 different dimensions. So complete, accurate, timely, validated, consistent, and unique. And each one of those in the framework, as you go through, you will see that they have a definition. How would you define that and understand it and go through, and why each one of these things, you need to be like kind of obsessed with keeping the quality of your data really high. Because if any of these aspects go down, as they go down, the quality of your threat hunts go down. So we need to really stay on top of this, because data schemas change over time, and upgrade to a new version. Now field names are different, and it is a whole thing, but it is worth it, and you got to invest the time into it. I'm not going to go through it in complete detail, but let me kind of just give you an example. So like timely is a very good example, especially when you're working with data sources that may be from different vendors. EDR to Windows event logs is a great example, right? So with EDR, like the time that it may take, depending on the solution for that event to show up in your centralized data source could be drastically different than something that coming directly from an endpoint. So depending on how your EDR is designed, it may hold on to events for so amount of time and then send them up in bulk. So it's not constantly streaming stuff out. It may hold things in the cloud for a while. So maybe it's got to go up into the cloud and then it comes down to your solution and then it gets ingested. Each one of those things is introducing a time gap, right? And if you're looking to try to execute something that is very focused on time, you need to understand what that is. And you can take a measurement to say, hey, if I do my test event and I do it on, in Windows, and I see how long does it take between the log is logged on the endpoint versus the time it's centralized. And now I can measure what the timeliness is of that. And of those three data sources, what is the timeliness of them and where is their scoring? And now I can say this is the quality of the data based on these are our thresholds, right? If it's going to take a second and a half, then I need to understand that. If I'm like trying to do a real-time search, is I might not be looking at all of the data at one time because it's going to be coming in at different times. Even though the timestamps might match, it actually making its way into the interface that the analyst is working with may be different. The other thing would be like accurate. Accuracy is a really good one because you can take ground truth to say, and that's a good example to talk about measurements because it's the easiest one to do. I look and say, hey, on the endpoint, here are all my Windows event logs, or all the Windows event logs that I expect centralized. And if there's a gap, that introduces a number, right? So you can do measurements, a simple division of all the events, how many are centralized that I expect. And if it's not 100%, if you get 99 out of 100, then you're at a 99. And you want to see that number go up. And this is also a really good metric that you can put into your quarterly updates to executive leadership to show the value that you're bringing, because you are constantly curating and working on the quality of your data, which is going to ultimately impact how good of a job that you're doing. So don't take it lightly. It is a lot of work, and I understand that, but it's going to have a huge impact. It's one of those big movers in terms of maturity of a threat hunting program is the organizations that do a really good job of taking care of their data. They do a really good job of taking care of finding the bad guys on your network. So as always, happy hunting, fam. Follow me on the socials. They'll be down below. Check out the GitHub repo, and I'm always looking for new ideas and new thoughts on these different things. I really am enjoying doing this and seeing how well it's being accepted by the community. So I'm going to keep this train rolling.